Hello and welcome to the Storytelling with Puck podcast. We will, as always, start with a story.
Okay, I'm Gary Nightingale, and this is the first chapter of The Madman in the Cellar, and this is the first part of it. A Saturday evening in early August 1979, we are eating our dinner in the lounge from trays on our laps, sausages and mash with peas fresh from the garden. Mum and Dad sit on the sofa. My sister and I are positioned on mismatched armchairs either side of the sofa. My left arm is in a sling, having cracked a bone on the last day of term. We were playing a ball game on the grass behind our classroom hut. As I reached into the air for the ball, I was body tackled from behind by Stephen Gordon, a strange whispering boy with a perpetual unsettling smile and a hangdog face mottled with freckles. The taciturn young Gordon dragged me sharply to the ground, and I landed on my elbow. In those days of limited communication and with no transport, somehow Mum managed to get me to Torbay Hospital. After waiting for hours to be seen, I was sent for an x-ray. Stephen had cracked my humerus. They gave me a sling and we went home. That summer, I fell in love with music. On the beach, as the other village kids swam and splashed in the sea, I sat on the shingle with a transistor radio. The songs I heard then still raise the hairs on the back of my neck. I Can't Stand Losing You by the Police, My Sharona by the Knack, I Don't Like Mondays by the Boomtown Rats, and the first single I bought, Pop Music by M. Blondie, two-tone, new wave, popular culture's response to the aftermath of punk. Sid Vicious, who I've not yet heard of, died in February. Later this year, The Clash will release the album London Calling, perhaps the last true punk record. I discovered this new world in about 4 years when I ventured beyond the safety of the top 40 and start listening to John Peel. I once took that radio apart. The housing was made of plywood. As I sat on that beach, alone but for the songs crackling and whining from my wooden treasure box, the dynamics that would tear me to pieces lay dormant in the shadowed corners of my soul. Nobody knew they were there. It will take me a long time to realize I never had to do any of what followed, to understand that at any time, in any of the innumerable moments that make up the lost years of my late teens and early adulthood, I could have just stopped. To the people around me, I could simply have said, I'm leaving, and just walked away with no guilt, no regret, and without even a backward glance, and started again. But I didn't. It never occurred to me. I didn't know I could just do that. I didn't know I had a choice, which is the same as having no choice. We sit and eat our meal. We've all had our birthdays for the year, apart from my sister, who will be 9 in September. Dad is 33, Mum is 31, I am 12. We are watching Chips. Later we may watch a movie. Jaws is on again. In just a few days' time, ITV will shut down almost completely as technicians go on strike over pay. For now, however, there are 3 fully active channels, the 4th not due to air for another 3 years. There is no video, not in this house anyway. There's no iPlayer, no catch-up TV, no Netflix, no YouTube. You watch it when it's on or you miss it. In December, our new Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, will introduce the right to buy housing bill. One day in the far future, Mum will make her last payment on the council house in which we now sit and eat. Recession and more strikes threaten. Towards the end of the summer, the IRA will continue their campaign of terror by assassinating Earl Mountbatten. Across the Atlantic, Jimmy Carter has 2 more years left of his presidency. The world turns, but none of it really touches us in any direct, discernible way. Our family does not relate to any class or culture. We endure the poverty of the working class without the proud identity. We occasionally strive towards a superficial mimicry of the middle class, but lack its stability and self-assurance. Our fortunes fluctuate as rapidly as Dad's erratic cycling moods. Our income is as sporadic as his changeable and rootless ideas. We live in a frozen and isolated bubble. This bubble is made of glass and it bears a label. The label reads Bell's Whiskey. Their tagline is "For ye go," but no one goes. No one goes anywhere. No one is permitted to leave. That is our identity. That is our culture. But it is hidden. No one's allowed to talk about it. No one's allowed to go to the cluttered outside toilet and reach up to the ridge above the door where, lurking in the cobwebs, sits a half bottle of this evening's brooding amber supply. No one is allowed to pick through the hedge separating the back garden from the fields beyond and unearth the empty bottles, the labels faded and decayed and crawling with woodlice. It is forbidden to climb onto a chair and crawl through the hatch into the loft, to retrieve more of those empty bottles nestling in the poorly distributed lagging between the beams. The entire house is a complex maze of narrow walkways through heavily defended no-go zones. One must tread these paths with care, breath held and eyes wide. We live by one rule, a rule so deeply entrenched we are not even aware it exists. That rule is silence. There you go.
Thank you. I think I've heard and read bits of this before, and the end mode of the end word of silence is something that I think is also deserved in some ways for a moment of understanding with that story, and just taking time to absorb everything that you've just read. Before I talk any more about that, before we start properly, a little note to anybody who is listening to this podcast for the first time, or anybody who's maybe forgotten. My name is Stefano and I run Puck Creations. I'm the regular host of this podcast. If the title, Storytelling with Puck, hasn't given it away, this podcast is all about stories. We will share stories, chat about stories, and see how stories fit in with the business world too. Of course, we couldn't do that without our wonderful guests. And the guest that we have on today is the absolutely superb, in so many ways, Gary Nightingale. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much for sharing the beginning of the first chapter of your story. It's an exceptional story, but we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Before we do, would you like to just introduce yourselves to our listeners?
Yes, thanks, Stefano. And this is the first time I've ever been interviewed on a podcast, so I wasn't quite sure what to expect apart from what I know from listening to other podcasts. So yes, I'm Gary Nightingale. I live in South Devon, middle-aged English bloke, and my business is illustration. It's Gary Nightingale Business Illustration, and because I'm on LinkedIn with that, that's how I got to know Stefano. And I know that I was vaguely aware of Storytelling with Puck last year, but I didn't join in. And then this year, I really felt prompted to do it. So putting on my writer hat, I took part in that, and I just found it astounding. Just the response I got to my writing, the responses that I felt towards other people's writing, and just that whole connection. And I see a lot of people talk about being very narrow about your target audience and niching, and I can understand all that, and I do try to do it, but I have different things that I do, so keeping them all separate I find is a constant challenge.
I don't think you're alone in that. Lots of people do, and we won't maybe go into too much of the detail about niching now, but we do talk actually as part of Puck Creations about niching with our clients quite a lot. Yes. Because there are benefits to niching in terms of your focus. However, something that niching doesn't do is make you stand out, which is what everyone will tell you it does do. You'll hear from all over the place that having a niche is the way that you make yourself different. And often then that breaks down into a sector. So, for example, you might be an illustrator purely for people who I don't know, are single parents, and that might be your niche, if that's what you decided to do for some reason. And so you think, well, I stand out because I'm the only illustrator for people who are single parents. It won't take long, if you're successful, for somebody else to come along and also be an illustrator for people who are single parents. So niche in itself will not make you stand out. There's a lot of other things that make you stand out, including things like your personality, the way you connect to people, your purpose, your drive, how you operate. And the reason I wanted to mention all of that is because I think that's something that stories do. As you introduced yourself then, explained, and thank you, by the way, very much for your very kind words about storytelling with Puck. It's much appreciated. You explained that one of the things that hooked you to it, and one of the reasons that you liked it, was because of the connection, because you were able to connect with other people's stories, and you could, and you were getting feedback about the way that people were connecting with you through your stories. That's something that's unique to you. The stories you tell and how you tell those stories, nobody else can do, no matter how hard they try to copy you. It's impossible. And that's actually more likely to make you stand out than having a niche. Now, what I find quite special about you, however, is that you are right. You do have an array of talent and an array of different.
Meet this guy you're talking about.
Hang on a minute. Is this John? Oh no, sorry, Gary. I've got a different podcast. No, it's definitely Gary I'm talking about. What I actually loved, and you demonstrated this partly with Storytelling with Puck, but also since I've known you through LinkedIn and illustrations too, is the way that you're able to tell stories in so many different mediums. So, as we've discussed, and we'll get into a little bit more in a short while, you are an illustrator, and that is your primary business, and that's how you help clients to tell stories through the medium of illustration. But then in Storytelling with Puck, we saw this wonderful story that is, I'll let you explain more detail about that, actually, maybe a little bit later about this story. You can maybe say it's biographical. But then you also are able to express yourself again through writing in fiction, and people should look for Gary's opening fictional story that he told on in Storytelling with Puck too. But on top of that, you then got out the guitar and played a piece of music without words that also in itself told a story. So you have done something quite special, I think, in being able to express stories in quite a few different ways, which is something we try and encourage people to do as much as we can. Now, I've just been speaking for a little while, but I should get back to interviewing the guest. So tell me a little bit more, because I wanted to focus on this a little, about you playing the guitar, when you started playing the guitar.
Okay, yeah, that's nicely unexpected. Because I had a lot of thoughts while you were talking there, sort of going right back to the niching, but perhaps because we had a really good conversation recently talking about that, where it's more about the type of, I think for both of us, it's more about the type of people and the sort of characteristics and attributes and personality that you sort of niche on, rather than the sector, perhaps. The guitar, I mean, that one that I used, I've had years and years and years. I don't have any equipment. I've just got one acoustic guitar, and it's just like part of me. But I've been writing songs for a long time, and they've always been sort of on the sideline, really. And it's like, whether it's drawing or writing or playing guitar, it's like it comes from a part of me that is kind of separate to the rest, and starts to get twitchy if I don't pay attention, which is like why I have to try and keep a balance between it. But I've got all these songs, and I can honestly say I can't remember exactly how they came about. It's almost like it sort of sprung from somewhere unconscious, and which, because that one you're talking about, that was instrumental, but there are a lot that have got lyrics, and it's all around a sort of central hub, I suppose, of sort of experiences that I've had, which is unavoidable to talk about, to do with substance abuse, or drinking basically, and mental illness and recovery and all the spaces in between, and that it all seems to be about that. And
does that drive not just the musical stories, but also when you're not working, doing illustrations for business, does that also drive your illustrations and your fiction stories as well?
The fiction definitely, and that piece that I just read out, when on the storytelling with Puck, I told you I had a sort of clear choice between, do I push all my fiction stuff into this storytelling thing and keep the stuff that I really want to do private, which is just about me. And I'm glad that I went for that one. And I know I've read so many sort of interviews with writers who they use their fiction to tell their own stories, and all their characters are just different aspects of themselves. And that's something that, for me, that does happen. But the actual full-on autobiographical stuff had to come first. It was like, if I just try and write fiction, it sort of dries up and it just sounds false. And when I read it, I don't believe it. It just sounds like someone trying to make something up. But when I write the personal stuff, it's like it frees something, it shifts some block out the way, so that then I can, when I sit down to write about fictional characters, it's like they've come to life. So I can write fiction, and then when I look at it and read it back or show other people, it's like it's alive. These are the way fiction should be. And that to me was just, there was an amazing discovery. It's like, yes, I thought I couldn't write fiction, but I can. I just have to get all this other crap out the way first.
It's really interesting, actually. It's like you're clearing the path in some ways. I wonder if, and I'm very much projecting here, I think, but I wonder if there's something to, when you talk about having to write the autobiographical stuff first, I wonder if there's something to the idea of when you're trying to write fiction and you haven't written the autobiographical stuff, that you almost are actively avoiding trying to write anything like you when you're writing the fiction. And that's when you said earlier, it stops becoming believable, because it's so false that it's nowhere near you. And so if you can't see it yourself, how is anybody else supposed to see it?
That's, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think that is what's happening. And it's almost like the autobiographical stuff. It's like it demands to be told. And even if I'm only telling it to myself and reading it out in scenarios like this or in the storytelling, and I don't know where it's going to go. I don't see it ever being published. To me, it's like a vital step towards writing fiction, because the more I do it, I mean, I carry a notebook around all the time and I'm always scribbling down ideas for jokes and illustrations and things. And just the odd thing that I see, I'll just make a note of it. And that feeds into writing fiction. But I suppose it's like the autobiographical personal story is the foundation. It's like that has to be there for the other stuff to happen. And like I have to keep sight of it. And also, like I was thinking about this earlier, that on the surface of it, like what I just read out, if I listen to that, I think, God, what a miserable sod. Just like get your head out your ass and just stop living in the past, you know? And like, but to me, it was like, I can see the context of it. Like, I mean, I'm right. And it isn't just about me and my childhood and our family life. It's sort of, that is as a starting point for writing about the fiction, but it's also like, for me, a starting point of just understanding where I've come from and where people come from, you know, where my parents' generation came from, where their parents' generation came from. You know, I was thinking about this earlier, that it's nothing to do with blame or regret or wishing things were different. It's just an understanding, what was the world like for each generation? What were they coming from? What was in their world? What were they taught to do? You know, and I think it's just, to me, it's that it then gets much wider, you know, and I see like, okay, well, I'm trying to understand how things are for my generation with whatever issues you have to deal with, how do you deal with them now as opposed to how someone might have dealt with them 50 years ago? And I think it's actually a responsibility for every generation to do that, because the next generation doesn't want to be carrying your crap as well as theirs. They want you to sorted yours out. And that's kind of what it's about.
I'm not sure we think about that often enough, actually. But you make a wonderful point in terms of how things develop over time. So when I started writing this autobiographical piece, in some ways it was to get down your own feelings and to get stuff out. But then as it developed over time, you almost realized that you were doing a bit more with it, as you just described.
Yeah.
I won't repeat what you just said, but yeah, as you just described.
And it had to start somewhere. You know, it had to be just literally. There's a writer I love called Raymond Carver, does short story, or did. He's dead a long time now, but he used to say the most important bit was just putting black on white.
Yeah.
Just start. And that was what I was doing, and then it grew from there. So sorry, yeah, go on.
No, I'm with you. I completely agree with you. I agree with that point. As a writer, that is often the hardest thing, is just to get something down. You can go back, you can edit it later, you can take out the bits you don't like, add in bits that you think were missing. You can think about different scenarios and wonder where they are in the timeline and whether or not there should be a timeline at all. All of that stuff can come later. But the first thing is, as you eloquently put it, just put black on white, just put pen to paper. That's how you need to start. But I guess something I love about the way that you have written your autobiographical story is that, as much as it is autobiographical, it still draws your reader in almost like a fictional story might, because of the way that it's worded, because of the way that it's very descriptive, because of the way that you're painting the scene so that people can picture themselves. And also, I'm not sure how much you realize this or not, but for so many people, they of course have not been through the exact same situation as you, but they've been through something similar and had very similar feelings. And they are then able to relate to what you're writing because of the way that you're writing it. And for other people who haven't been through it, they're able to get a bit of a better understanding of where you were and what you've been through. And then what you mentioned earlier in terms of you're also getting a better understanding of the wider world and the different generations and how things changed. And as you then write that down, you're also allowing other people to either agree with you or disagree with you on their perspective on what they thought that world was like. And also people who were never in those generations have an opportunity to learn. So there's so many layers to the way that you wrote.
That's part of what I find fascinating about it, because I don't want it to be a self-absorbed, this is my story kind of thing. I want that to be the starting point that creates connection between other people. Like how I get when I read other people's stories, like so many stories in that Storytelling with Puck, is I'll get excited about something that they've written because it relates to something in me, and I want to talk to them about it. And so they might have just been writing about themselves and about their experience, but it doesn't come across as being self-absorbed. It comes across as, I'm just telling my story, now tell me yours, you know. And that is what I find interesting. And it's where someone is trying to understand something about themselves and about their place in the world, and then offering it up so that other people can help shape that understanding. And it just, if you just keep things to yourself, it's like, I really believe it, that a story isn't a story until it's told, that it's just, it just becomes a internal conversation that just goes stale and goes nowhere, you know.
There's definitely a truth to that. And actually, I think it's a perfect segue to telling the second part of this chapter, if you would be so kind.
Oh, the next part.
Yes.
Okay. Maybe I should put more jokes in it.
It's okay. We'll tell them in between. Just think of one for the nothing too rude. I'm not sure if the audience wants.
Okay, here goes. Number 2. Sunlight beams through the back window, illuminating dancing motes of dust in the TV screen's subdued glow. No one speaks. Mum has cut up my sausages and I eat with my right hand. Gradually, I notice that Dad has stopped eating. He holds his knife and fork and just stares at his half-empty plate. His face is contorted with distress, which immediately sets my heart thumping. My whole body tenses, causing a momentary painful twinge in my cracked upper left arm. My pulse rate shoots up into the red. Yet I too am conflicted. Dad appears to be sober. In this condition, the spectrum of his behaviour is fairly narrow and can be easily gauged and adjusted to. Without alcohol, my father ranges from attention-seeking hyperactivity to a sullen and self-absorbed shutdown. But with the addition of alcohol, he can zigzag through that range several times in a matter of minutes, dragging a host of other behaviours along for the ride. But sober, pretty easy to manage. Uncomfortable, yes, but with little risk of any aggressive outburst or sudden unhinged screaming meltdown. This is different. This is new and I don't like it. I can't read it and I don't know how to prepare. Quietly, deliberately, Dad lifts the tray from his knees and sets it on the coffee table. He leans back a little, forearms resting on his thighs, and says quietly, "I can't do this anymore." The house freezes in uncomprehending horror. "I just can't do this," my father continues, gesturing vaguely with his right hand, "anymore." He speaks with a trembling voice, a new voice, unlike any other sound to come out of his mouth. He lifts his hands to his face, fingers sliding beneath his glasses, then draws those fingers down over his cheeks. "I'm lonely," he whispers, still in that new voice. Behind thick, nicotine-stained lenses, the exposed whites of his eyes are shot with tiny red rivers. "I'm deeply unhappy." That dismal voice, wavering yet somehow invested with a strange kind of strength, a resolution wholly absent before today. This voice doesn't come from anywhere on that spectrum of predictable mental states. It comes from somewhere else entirely. This voice shakes with seeming fragility, yet also commands a curiously novel authority. "I'm messed up," the voice says. "I think I'm ill, very ill, but I don't know what with. I don't know what it is." Dad shrugs. "I need help, but I don't even know what for." We've all stopped eating. Adverts. Hofmeister Lager. Shall I pour him one? No way, he's driving the lorry. My sister is a statue of terror. My mother looks at her husband with an expression that simply cannot be read, no matter how adeptly one has mastered this particular survival skill. I peer down at what remains of my neatly sectioned sausages. A stray pea rolls the length of my tray. My mind races in blind panic, searching wildly for something familiar to grasp, but there is nothing. This new terrain is entirely alien. Dad slumps back into the sofa, dropping his palms to his thighs with a conclusive slap. What now? Of course, this never happened. I don't have the imagination to try and picture what would have followed if it did. The very worst thing would have been for nothing to happen, which is also sadly the most likely outcome. No one would have known what to do. I don't know if my father was capable of such insight into his tragic and trapped state, but if he was, I never heard him try to express it. He may well have privately considered many times saying such words, allowing space for that new voice, trying to reach out from the labyrinth of his secret suffering. In the darkness of his fragmented inner world, he may occasionally have heard and tried to respond to that gentle but persistent whisper in the ear of his soul, barely audible above the relentless, chaotic noise. Or it may simply have never occurred to him. We'll never know. This is 1979, in a council house at the top end of a small village on the South Devon coast. There isn't exactly a family therapist setting out their stall on every corner. The revolution in digital technology and communication that will come to transform how we live and how we try to understand ourselves in the next 4 decades is still in its infancy. There's no Google, no catchy and encouraging buzzwords like vulnerability and authenticity float in on the breeze. No Brené Brown rallies us to show up as our true selves. If anyone's even thinking like that right now, such ideas have not reached as far as us. There are no supportive Facebook communities, no WhatsApp groups, no confidential helplines. there's nothing. In this mental health backwater, if you're brave enough to admit, even to yourself, that you might need help, the very real fear of misunderstanding and ridicule that almost certainly awaits you should you try and talk to anyone about it will debilitate you into inaction. You will stay locked in your destructive patterns without ever knowing what's really driving you. So, in our glass bubble, we remain prisoners of the silence, an invisible shroud of dysfunction and denial, in which our family's unseen crisis is permitted to broaden and deepen with each passing year, facing no opposition whatsoever.
You okay?
Yeah, I'm good. Something else I wanted to say about that as well is that if I don't do that, I get depressed and frustrated and confused and things get a bit disorganized. But if I focus on just doing that, it's like when I'm actually doing it, it touches this like really raw place inside me. Mm-hmm. And then when I stop doing it, it's like, okay, I can close that for now. These are memories. This is stuff in the past. I'm back in the present. And I'm actually, it sounds like I'm apologizing.
Please don't apologize. I don't sound like you're apologizing.
It's like I have to go and visit it and feel it all. And then I come back and I go, oh, thank God, I'm here. And then I feel all right. And then I go and draw cartoons for people to put on their blogs. And
we'll come on to those cartoons in a second, actually. There were so many moments in that story that just really hit home. That it's impossible to go through every single one, but a couple of things. One, from what you just said. Sometimes I think getting things down on paper and also getting things out and reading things is a kind of therapy. I'm no therapist and I'm no expert on this. I think it's the second time I've said it in a podcast talking about therapy, actually. So I shouldn't be trying. I'm really not trying to state myself in that way. But I find that writing for me is so cathartic. It really is. And that, as you say, sometimes getting it out, it almost makes it as if you're looking at it objectively instead of you being the subject.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so that's what I felt were able to do with that story. But the bit I wanted to ask about, and the bit that I guess really stuck in my mind from when you read it to all the way through to the end of the story. So you're picturing this world, this almost hopeful world of what could have been in this section, in this chapter. But then the reality hits in as we get towards the end of the story of the idea of it was a generation where it was never going to happen.
That's it, like we were talking about before.
Mm-hmm. My question is, how much do you think things have genuinely improved?
I would say, a few of the things that I touched on there that were just in a different environment in terms of communication. And I think that itself has had a social, cultural impact on openness. Mm-hmm. That it's all about balance. It can be like, I suppose at the most trivial level, the idea 40 years ago of someone sending everyone a picture of their dinner.
Yeah.
Get crazy, but
especially in England at that time, an overcooked chicken.
So that's what I mean about, like, if you think, well, I'm 53, so I was born in the 60s. So people born in the 60s, their parents were probably born not long after the war, so the whole world was still reeling from the Second World War that it was told would never happen again, and just that whole time and place, it was just unheard of to speak about things. And perhaps that sort of tight-lipped stoicism was actually what the world needed, certainly what this country needed. We need to rebuild. And this was, if you think back to the time of like the 40s and 50s, this is like, I can't imagine what it's like to be in that world, not knowing what the civil rights movement is like, not knowing feminism. We've just had, like you hear so much now about unprecedented times. Well, that back then the unprecedented times would have been the war, the Holocaust, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, these things sending shockwaves around the world. And then these people, people grow. I'm generalizing massively here, just to understand sort of the different world that generation. And then the next generation, James Dean came and invented the teenager, so that changed everything.
Yeah.
And then there's my dad growing up in London in the 60s, and you just, obviously there was mental health around, but I know that going back to my late teens and early 20s, things would have been very different if I'd had just more information, more awareness. And I think there is that now. So going back, that's a very long way round to answering your question. I think the way that things have improved is with the accessibility of information that can give you awareness that you need, which is the good side of it. Obviously, there's the intrusive, trivial, overwhelm side of it.
Yeah, there's definitely.
And I think our generation has sort of lived through a transition, almost like people. I won't presume to know how old you are, but I'm guessing it's younger than me.
I'm a little bit younger than you, but we won't go into too much detail.
I mean, if you think like, our generation is the one who knows what it's like to live like, where social media is such a central part of your world, and you know how to use it and live with it, but you also know what it's like for that not to exist. Yeah. You know what it's like to have a black and white TV and go to color and then go to remote, and then, so it's almost like at a simple level, I suppose our generation has seen the whole world move from kind of analog to digital, that sort of transition. And I think that has brought a cultural change in the way that people see themselves, and perhaps that just get on with it, stiff upper lip, don't talk about things, may have served a really good purpose in the past. It might have, maybe just things wouldn't have got done without it. But I think it gets to a point where that itself becomes harmful, where you can't just get on with it because there's too much, and then it becomes a denial. And
it's interesting. I think you're right to an extent. I think there's definitely something to the idea of allowing things to happen and understanding that things are happening and just going with the flow sometimes, and realizing that there's a lot that you can't control, realizing that you can't do anything about certain things. And so there's no point in letting it build up inside of you and kind of having that those anxious feelings, that anxiety. And in some ways, certain parts of modern life reflect that. Certain parts of things like meditation, for example, when you're doing it how it's supposed to be done, are all about understanding, acknowledging what's going on, and saying, okay, these are all the things that are happening. These are the things that I can focus on, that are in my control. Everything else I can't do anything about, so I'm just going to get on with it. And so it almost goes back to those times in some ways, but without the anguish of you worrying about the things that you can't control over and over and over, which I think is one of the major contributors to anxiety and to depression, is all of that worry or things that you can't control. I think I am oversimplifying things massively, but that is, I think, the key to a lot of it.
Yeah. I think we're talking about hugely complicated things. You can't help but generalize or simplify to a certain extent.
Exactly. That's it. It's very difficult to. There's a billion causes, and we all have the symptoms, if that makes sense. And going into every single cause is hard to do. So sometimes you try and narrow it down into one particular form, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think you make a good point, but I think the key that you said at the very beginning of your answer was related to communication and the idea that now, yes, there are trivial things which can be annoying, but in general, the idea that there is communication about mental health. It is okay to talk about it. It is okay to understand that people have mental health challenges, and therefore you don't feel alone. I think that is one of the key differences from your story and from the times that your dad went through.
And I think that's one of the massive bonuses, benefits of the internet, of social media.
Yeah.
That is definitely on the tick side of that whole revolution. Is that, and if I think back to my early 20s, when I can now describe exactly what was going on, I know why I was the way I was. But I was.
That's something you want to talk about. You don't have to, by the way.
It just because as things went on, I developed a pretty severe alcohol problem pretty young, and I mean, by the time I was 24, I was washed up, and I went to AA and just stopped drinking for 20 years.
Wow.
But that was compounded by depression, and I mean, really severe depression. But the reason that I talk about it and compare it to now is that there just wasn't, because there was no end. I couldn't just go on my phone and type into Google, what's wrong?
What's wrong with me?
It didn't occur to me that there might be something that I wasn't to blame for or that I could get help with. It was just something to struggle with on your own. And I think that was a throwback from previous generations, was that you don't talk, you deal with things yourself. It just wasted a lot of time and didn't get very far. And I think now, it's like we were talking about LinkedIn earlier, and I'm connected with a few people who are therapists. There's someone who I know who calls herself a family therapist, works with troubled families, works with people who have all these kind of issues. And I see that and it just warms my heart. I just see that there's someone doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's open and it's okay. And if you go to a therapist, you're not seen as weird. You're just seen as, oh, okay, that's life. That's what we all need to go through sometimes, or some people need to go through. And
it was, yeah. And I look back now and it's like at any time I could have just gone, hang on, there's something wrong here. I'm doing my best. It's not my fault. I need help with it. But those thoughts weren't in my head. It was just, so that is, I suppose that's one of the main drivers of writing all this, is just understanding that how much worse than that it would have been for my dad. Had all that kind of male bravado and stuff. And like for him to actually imagine him in a pub with his mates just saying, actually, this isn't right. It's not going to happen.
He probably wouldn't have got very far. I think.
What about his parents? Like, I mean, they were sort of like London East End gangsters. I mean, that would have been like even harder. You don't say, right, I'm feeling a bit anxious today. Like.
I think what you're showing here, Dad, I think what I quite like almost about you thinking about it in this way is it's so personal to you, but you're still able to have almost a generational empathy, which I think is again something that is, I don't know whether or not it's developing more in our generation or if it's disappearing more. It's impossible to tell. And it's something I don't want to generalize about. But I think having a level of empathy and understanding that people are in different situations and going through different things and you are not in that position is so important. And it's something that I think stories really help with. That sometimes if people say, this person over here is in this position, why don't you put yourself in their shoes? People's just like, oh yeah, I don't care. But when someone tells a story and shows you their shoes, shows you the path that they're walking on, shows you the challenges that they've had, empathy is a lot easier to come by because you can then picture yourself in that world. As we chat about the empathy that comes through storytelling, now's probably a good time to remind you that you're listening to episode 4 of the Storytelling with Puck podcast. Our guest in this episode is the magnificent Gary Nightingale. His guitar playing was accompanying us as we spoke earlier, and we'll enjoy a little more of that before the end. Don't forget that we'll finish this podcast in the same way as we always do, with a Puck Creations story. But for now, let's get back to chatting about storytelling as we look forward to the final part of Gary's The Madman in the Cellar.
Storytelling creates that empathy because there's that excitement to be connected. So you want to feel it, to be invested in someone because it resonates with some part of you. And that's so important. And for me, it was, I see quite a lot of it. I see quite a lot online of people who sort of say that they've had troubled past and they cut off all ties with their family. And to me, that, well, it's just a personal decision. Everyone has to make their own. But for me, that's just so much the wrong way to go. You know, I'm actually very close to my family, very loyal to my family. So I can balance the two things where I can see the things that I believe weren't helpful that I've had to deal with that would have been a lot quicker and easier done differently, but still be part of it, you know. And it's like, you know, who am I to look back and resent anyone? It's my job to understand, you know, and forgiveness is a kind of meaningless word, really. It's to me.
No, but I mean, if it's just understandable vocabulary, if it's just a word, it is. But when it actually means something to you and you live by it, then it's a different world. I wouldn't necessarily, personally, I wouldn't say, you know, there's a right or wrong way to go. I just think that there are ways, and people have their ways of coping and ways of dealing with it.
Yeah, people do what they have to do to survive. And then if I look the other way, look ahead to my children and what happened with the divorce and everything, you know, that is, I mean, that's a whole different story that we won't go into, but just to let you know that it's there. You look back, look at the past, try and understand it, look at yourself now, and then look ahead. You know, what difference can I make?
I think that kind of reflection is really important. And talking of reflection, and to do another very dodgy segue, maybe we could reflect on the third part of this chapter of the story, if that's okay.
Okay. After he died, Dad's second wife told me he'd been diagnosed with manic depression, now known, of course, as the more complex spectrum of bipolar disorder. For as long as we remained a family before my parents' bitter and violent divorce in 1985, my father was never diagnosed and therefore never treated. Had he been able to find the courage and awareness within himself to make the hypothetical leap of faith just described, he could have been assured that, although he had neither the knowledge nor the language to articulate his agony, he would have been right to try and do so. His instincts would have been right. But what about me now? From my privileged position here in the sci-fi future of 2021, I do have the language my father would have grasped for so desperately. I now have those words. They belong to me, and every single one of them was wrestled from the icy grip of the silence on my private and unseen battlefield. This is what was really going on for our family in the late 1970s and early 80s. Dad, in his early 30s, has been deeply dependent on alcohol since his troubled teens. He suffers from untreated, severe mental illness. My father lives daily with unhealed trauma from a brutal childhood of abandonment and neglect, a weeping, pulsing wound that moans and lurches uncontrollably beneath the veneer of our lives. This writhing damage will remain untouched until his death in 1998. In his isolated pain, my dad is also a perpetrator of physical, mental, and emotional abuse. When the whiskey flows, his pent-up frustration explodes in sudden bursts of hair-trigger violence. I never knew who he really was. He probably didn't know either. He never found a single moment in which to step back from the unceasing demands of our collective dysfunction and calmly ask himself what was really going on. To tell it all to just shut up for a minute, to sit quietly, to honestly ask himself two simple but vital questions. Who am I and what do I want? I don't know what my dad believed, if anything at all. His whole life was one big act. The only way to break that act, to stop the show, is to just stop. To choose that specific moment on a specific day and announced to the world, I'm not doing this anymore. My father never found that moment, one single instant of time in all those decades of lies and pretense, with all that waste and heartache piling up ever higher in their wake. In the pubs, my dad was an entertainer, with a repertoire that drew upon an inexhaustible supply of material from sitcoms and Michael Caine movies, Peter Sellers and Monty Python routines. Adverts? No way, he's driving the lorry. Jokes, regional accents, and impersonations. Everyone loved my dad. But that guy stayed in the pub. The man whose second-hand ex-company car screeched into a space down the road, who made the dog go crazy when he staggered up the path and rattled his keys against the front door. This was not the guy in the pub. No, we got the deeply disturbed and wounded cripple, reeking of stale beer and whiskey, taking out his pain and rage on us whose unfortunate destiny it was to share his fractured path. My father grew up in poverty and hardship in London's East End until his mother married money from Nottingham. Her firstborn son got dragged away from his sister and sent to boarding school, where the kids born into money ripped into shreds. I have one photograph of him as a child, and he looks just like any other innocent little boy. He didn't stand a chance. He never found it. He never recovered. He never created that sacred moment of decision and irreversible change, nor found the courage to step into that moment and claim it as his own. He never did set his tray down and make that declaration. It didn't happen. The time was wrong. The place was wrong. The culture was wrong. The dark machinery of our family's dysfunction rolled on, unchecked and unquestioned, desecrating all in its path that gives life its meaning, power, and fragile beauty. And then it met me. This is the story of that long and strange encounter. This is my story.
I think we'll leave that with the listeners to absorb and to take in their own way. My final comment on it is just, it's so powerful, and I'm so grateful that you decided to write it down, share it with us, and also to read it with me and then all the listeners on Storytelling with Puck podcast. I can't express how grateful I am. So just thank you so much.
Well, before we leave it, I'd just like to return that and actually say thank you for the opportunity to do it. And I'm grateful for the response it got, where it was kind of in a very fragile state, emerging from a cave, and it could so easily have just gone back in. In fact, it did at one point. And then I had people messaging me and saying, I want to read the rest. Where is it? So, yeah, I'm really grateful to you and Sam for that too. So thank you.
Well, from that point, we'll move on. Yeah, let's lighten up. It's okay. I think we need light and shade. Without the shade, there is no light. So that's a cliche that makes no real sense. But anyway, but I want to talk a little bit more, and the idea of who you are to businesses, and how some people know you. They might not know any of this writing, any of the guitar or anything else. What most people know you for, your illustrations and your cartoons, and
from a client point of view, certainly, yeah.
Yes, sorry, from a business client point of view is what I meant there. And so they're still very much stories, though. And so what is it you do for your clients? What is it that they come to you for, and how do you help them?
Okay, well, firstly, going back to what we were saying before about it, it's almost like I came across my ideal client gradually took shape because of the people I was already working with. It made me want to work with more people like that. And it's so mostly people who are coaches, trainers. I used to say consultants, but I really hesitate to say that because I don't quite know what it means, and none of them call themselves consultants. So coaches and trainers, and it's people who are very passionate about sort of singular message, something that they're trying to achieve, and a lot of it sort of made up with perhaps abstract concepts that I help give shape to and give form to, and sort of just by illustrating them using sort of cartoon characters and diagrams, a combination of the two, so that you can look at it and instantly or their audience rather, instinctively on a gut level will look at an image and I get that, I'm interested in that. I don't fully get it, so I need to read more to find out.
Yeah, it's a pathway almost. Maybe it's the if we play with another cliche, it's the first 1,000 words that lead people into then reading the next 1,000 words. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, so it is. It's like I imagine that what I'm doing is like a picture on a shop window. Someone sort of stops and looks at it and like, that's interesting. That's kind of, I relate to that from my world. I'll go inside and find out what this is about. And then they come out buying a training course.
That wasn't what I expected, but I will.
Yeah. So from a sort of practical level, yeah, it's people who are a number of regular clients now where it's weekly illustrations for blogs, articles, LinkedIn posts. They tend to get sort of shared across the board. And as well as someone I'm working with, as well as doing that, is putting together a big training program that he's got the backing of a major body in his industry.
Brilliant.
Who are really interested in what he's doing. He's really passionate about it, and he's and I'm excited to be part of it. And so that's part of the way things are changing now. I mean, that's a direct result of the pandemic, is that they can't go into workplaces and deliver training anymore. They have to move it all online. So they might be super confident experts in what they do, stood next to a whiteboard in front of a room full of people, but put them on Zoom and they freeze and like, I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know how to get this stuff across. So I kind of help do that.
And the illustrations and kind of animation, I guess, sometimes helps to almost be a prompt. And I know that whenever I present, and I know that a lot of professional presenters will talk about the idea of if you can give your audience something tangible to play with, then it makes them instantly more interactive. But of course, on a virtual conference, that's very, very difficult to do. So almost in some ways, being able to see an illustration, it's not tangible, but they can at least picture something instantly, and they can be part of the story, as we always talk about, before somebody starts speaking, and they can be working little things out in their head. What does this mean? And then it becomes clearer as the speaker explains.
That's it, yeah. And since I started getting into animation, sort of doodly style stuff where you see the writing and pictures appear on the screen, and so I've been doing some stuff like that for a video for a client, and I'm starting to do it more for other people. And so the last sort of 2 or 3 months have been a really steep learning curve where I've had to learn a whole load of things that I'm saying with anything new, I look at it and just panic and freeze for a little while, and then I'm like, oh, I get stuck in, and then it's kind of a good feeling when you've gone through that stage and you're like, I can do this now.
Yeah, I feel like talking about relatability again. I think you'll pretty much have everybody who's listening, their ear will go, yeah, I know that feeling. The kind of the idea is something new. Panic. Oh, hang on, this is working. Oh, is it working? I'm not sure. Hang on. Yeah, that's it. All done. It's
working. Yes. I want to do more of this. And like, yeah, and that's me adapting to how things are now. Where as things move more online, I needed to get better at offering what I do for the online world, and having more of a range of what I could do that would fit the online world, it's all part of actually helping people get their message across. And I'm trying to find another way of saying stand out.
Differentiate themselves.
Differentiate. Brilliant.
I have to find different ways of saying stand up pretty much every single day, so that one's in. That one's in
You got a mental list to choose from.
Yeah, exactly. So on that note, and if people do want to stand out and they do want to use your illustrations to help them do that, where can they find you? Where can they find your website or any of your social media?
Okay, my website is unpublished at the moment. It's got big boards around it, like a building site.
Okay. We'll leave that in the construction, and we'll add it once it's ready to all the documentation.
Really, LinkedIn, Gary Nightingale Business Illustration, and that's where I am. It has all my contact details on it, and if you scroll through my feed, you'll see a mixture of client work, my own whimsical thoughts late at night, and something I like doing as well, which I find is popular, and I like it when other people do it, is sharing your journey when you haven't quite got there yet. You know, like it's not too polished then, and I think that actually makes it relatable. Like, I've just got myself a drawing tablet, and I'm learning how to use it, and these are my first attempts. You know, it's the kind of stuff that it doesn't make sense. You should keep that stuff under wraps until you've got it cracked. But I kind of just say, well, this is what I'm doing at the moment, and I don't know, it just seems to work, and that to me is part of a personal brand. It's about being open and showing people that you're a work in progress. Because the client I mentioned before, who's doing that big project, that's one of the things that we actually really enjoy about working together, because he's doing something he's never done before.
Right.
And he's happy to say to me, I want you to try and do this. Can you do it? And I'll say, no, I don't know what you're talking about, but I'll have a go. And then we come up with something, and then it gets better and it gets better and it gets better. And it's a really exciting process where we're both learning. And to me, that's a strength. You know, I think saying, yes, I'm really good at that, and then going away and crapping yourself is dishonest. To say, I'm really good at learning and I'm naturally creative, but this is a particular skill that I've got no experience in, so I'm going to give it a bash. If you're happy to watch me do that, and then you get some really unexpected, brilliant results. Sorry, I don't call it. I mean, what happens between you is brilliant.
Yes, well, you may not want to say about yourself, but I will also say that the results of what you do that I've seen are brilliant. The actual results too, not just the process. For anyone who is listening and is maybe thinking, well, I'm not sure if I need illustration. Even if you don't, you might be right. Maybe you don't need illustration, but it's well worth just going and checking out Gary's profile on LinkedIn, because whether it's just for the pure entertainment value of how great his illustrations are, or if it does persuade you that actually maybe it could be something worthwhile in your business, it's worth just having a look. It will take 10 minutes of your time because it's brilliant. And you won't regret it.
Just about that, can I just add something to that briefly? Sure. Is that if someone shows an interest in what I do, I'm pretty thorough on doing the background, and so that when we get on a call, I can talk to them regardless of whether it goes any further. I'll still make suggestions about, like, I can see where this works well, or from a wider visual content perspective, you know, looking at people's blogs, looking through their social media. And usually the things I'm looking for are inconsistency or overused stock images, stuff that looks kind of ad hoc, and because part of what I do is making things consistent. Obviously, I develop a particular style for each client based on who they are and what they do. So people come to recognize that, because week in, week out, they're seeing the same style of visual content that matches the writing and tone. And so, you know, if I get on a call with someone, and if they decide they don't want illustrations, or they do from someone else, I'll still give some pointers about, I think this would really improve it if you could do this.
I think that's hugely valuable. As you say, sometimes I think people are a little bit nervous to make that initial approach, because they then think they're going to be hooked into a sale with all sorts of different people, all sorts of different companies. So
don't try.
Well, yeah, I'm sure you will. But the idea that you will also just be there to help, and if you don't get the sale, then you know you won't hate them.
Then I block them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I don't.
So on that note, don't get blocked by Gary, but do make sure you give him a follow. And I promise you, he doesn't really block you. I'm sure I've given him abuse over time, and he's not blocked me yet. So we're all on happy notes. But Gary, we'll cut loose in a second. I will read, as has become tradition, a Puck Creations story in a second. But for now, thank you so much for joining us. It has genuinely been a pleasure, and I know I've already said it, but I can't thank you enough for reading your story and sharing it with the Storytelling with Puck world. It's truly amazing.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for asking me. And surprisingly, I was quite nervous before, but I've really enjoyed it, and it's just thank you very much.
My pleasure. Oh, as you said about being nervous, if anybody wants to Gary as a podcast guest in the future, I think you've seen how good it will be. So go for it.
There was nobody else in the cafe. Bina looked around. It was lunchtime, crunch time. The weather was fine. The church bells had chimed. Her clothes were still hanging on the line. As she looked out the window, she saw not 1, 2, 3, but 4. Left, right, left, right, left, right, left. A pin in their jacket, a gun in their hand. This wasn't an invasion, it was theft. As she looked out the window in awe, behind the 4 there were more. No, there was nobody else in the cafe. Bina looked around. He just said, "Hi. Look, guys, I learned how to tie a tie." They shot him to the ground. He died without a sound. The child, who was not yet bound.
You've just been listening to the Storytelling with Puck podcast. We'll be back very soon, so make sure you subscribe and catch up on any of the episodes you've missed.